Welcome. This is the mini lecture for Chapter 13, the Mundell-Fleming model. Let's get started. Mundell-Fleming is a version of, an extension of ISLM for open economies. It takes into account exchange rates and imports and exports. The key assumption here is that we're dealing with a small open economy with perfect capital mobility. What is a small open economy with perfect capital mobility, you ask? Perfect capital mobility means that there are no restrictions on the international flow of capital. The country's residents can borrow or lend as much as they want in the world financial markets. And because the country is small, how much they borrow or lend in the world markets has absolutely no effect on those world markets. It does not, in particular, change the world interest rate. Perfect capital mobility also means there are no capital controls. Capital controls, that's a term economists use to refer to restrictions that governments place on the amount of money or capital you can bring into, or more commonly, take out of a country. After the Second World War, many countries had capital control. I need more. There we go. Many countries had capital controls that basically prevented people from taking their money out of countries so they could invest it somewhere better. Very few countries have capital controls today. One big exception is China. If you have invested in China, or you're a wealthy person domestically in China, the Chinese government makes it very difficult through a variety of methods to take your money out of the country. Laser pointer, there we go. Here, R represents the domestic equilibrium interest rate. In ISLM, that was the only interest rate. But since we are in a world market now, R star represents the market interest rate in the international financial markets. Since our imaginary country has perfect capital mobility, the world and domestic rates will always be the same. They have to be, because if they weren't, there would be an arbitrage opportunity. What is arbitrage? Arbitrage is buying and selling something at two different prices. An example, you could borrow at the lower rate, whichever one that is, and then lend at the higher one. Since the economy is small, its domestic rate will change to match the international rate rather than the other way around. Essentially, if you're part of the world markets, you are going to import the world equilibrium price. In the ISLM model, output was defined as C plus I plus G. Consumption as a function of disposable income, output minus taxes. Investment as a function of the domestic interest rate there, no star, plus G, government spending. But now we're adding in net exports. So output equals consumption plus investment, which is a function of the world interest rate, plus government spending, plus net exports, which are a function of E. Lowercase e is the exchange rate. Now, in the ISLM model, there we go, we can manipulate the goods market or the money markets to shift the IS and LM curves to produce a variety of different output interest rate combinations. Now, we typically use that to figure out how to change the size of the economy on the horizontal axis. But if we wanted to, we could do the same thing to change the interest rate. If you want a higher interest rate, just contract the money supply. LM will shift left, the economy will contract, and the interest rate will go up. And if you don't make any further changes, the interest rate would stay at that new higher level. You could do the same thing if you, for whatever reason, wanted the interest rate to be lower. But that only works in a closed economy. If you're in an open economy, where people have the option to borrow and lend in world financial markets, then the domestic interest rate can't stay at any level other than the world market equilibrium. Imagine you wanted to make your economy bigger using ISLM. So you increased government spending. The IS curve would shift right, output would go up, and the domestic interest rate would fall. If the economy was closed, as ISLM assumes, that would be the end of the story. But if the economy is open, you have now created a big problem. Assuming you start out with the domestic interest rate being the same as the world rate, well, now the domestic interest rate is lower than the world rate. This, again, creates the arbitrage opportunity. You could borrow money, in this case domestically, at the lower rate, and then lend it out on the international markets at the higher rate and pocket the difference. Now, since we're a small country, this would have no effect at all on the world financial markets or the world equilibrium interest rate. But domestically, in this case, you're going to be borrowing and borrowing and borrowing so you can lend to the international markets. But domestically, you'd keep borrowing. Eventually, that will drive the domestic interest rate up. And it'll keep driving it up until it's exactly the same as the world rate again, and the arbitrage opportunity closes. So in an open economy, the domestic interest rate can differ from the world interest rate temporarily, but it can't stay there. It's always going back to the world rate, which means ISLM can't model an open economy. Mundell-Fleming fixes that by including a third curve here, showing all the possible points of equilibrium in your country's balance of payments. This is why sometimes this is called the ISLM BOP model. The line's horizontal because it's saying essentially you can have any level of domestic output you want, but the interest rate is always going to end up at this value, the world equilibrium. And any point that is not on that line means your balance of payments are not in equilibrium. Any point above the BP curve means your country has a balance of payments surplus. Below means you have a balance of payments deficit. Now, Mundell-Fleming, it's a model of a small open economy. This creates a teaching problem. If I was teaching this course in, for example, New Zealand, I could give all sorts of examples from the local economy, New Zealand, of how this model works describing our economy. The problem is we're not New Zealand. We're in the United States, and the United States is not a small open economy. We are an open economy, but we are not price takers. We have market power. So what we do domestically does change the world financial markets equilibrium. And so Mundell-Fleming, or ISLM BOP, does not work to describe the economy of the United States. So, for teaching purposes, for the rest of this lecture, we're going to pretend the United States is a small economy. Think Hawaii. That way we can talk about dollars and imports and exports from the US perspective, which we're most familiar with, without getting into complications that this model just can't handle. And I call this South Canada because it amused me to do so. All right. Now, exchange rates. Broadly speaking, there are two types of exchange rate systems, floating and fixed. In a floating exchange rate system, the exchange rate between your currency and foreign currencies is determined by the market. If you think of the exchange rate as the price of your currency, then a floating system lets the price move to whatever supply and demand in the foreign exchange markets prefer. Now, in a fixed exchange rate system, the country's central bank decides it wants to keep the price of the currency fixed at a certain level. Then the central bank will intervene in the foreign exchange markets, buying and selling currency, to try and force the price of the domestic currency back to whatever their target is. Let's look at how Mundell-Fleming works with floating exchange rates and then with fixed exchange rates. This is the regular ISLM graph with the balance of payments curve added. Let's assume you start here. In regular ISLM, increasing the money supply will shift the LM curve right to LM prime, which will make equilibrium go from the point E0 to the point E1. But since now exchange rates are flexible, something different happens. At point E1, the domestic interest rate is below the world rate. The world rate is up here, and now we're down there. So since the domestic rate is below the world rate, people don't want to hold assets denominated in our Hawaii dollars because they earn a very low interest rate on Hawaii investments. So everybody will sell dollars, but that will make the price of the currency, the exchange rate, go down. A cheaper dollar will increase net exports, since foreigners can now buy more of our products with the same amount of their currency. And because net exports rise, the IS curve will shift right from IS to IS prime. So the final equilibrium is not here at E1, it's at point E2. At the same interest rate, the world rate as we started with, but production has increased. This shows that if you have a flexible exchange rate, monetary policy does work. Now let's look at fiscal policy. Does fiscal policy work in an open economy? If the government increases spending, it would shift the IS curve right from IS to IS prime. This would move the equilibrium from E0 to E1. But the economy will now have a balance of payments surplus because the domestic interest rate is above the world rate. If you have a flexible exchange rate, that's going to make the value of your currency go up. The dollar's worth more, so now we can buy more imports for the same number of dollars. And American goods will be more expensive for foreigners to buy, so net exports will fall. And the IS curve will be forced right back to where it started. This implies that fiscal policy will not work in a small open economy if you have a floating exchange rate. So, floating exchange rate, monetary policy still works, but fiscal policy does not. Now let's look at fiscal and monetary policy, but with a fixed exchange rate. If you try to stimulate the economy by increasing the money supply, you would start out at the intersection of the IS curve and the LM curve, E0. The LM curve would shift right to LM prime, and the equilibrium would go to E1. But because the domestic interest rate is now below the world rate, everybody's going to want to sell dollars, and that'll make the exchange rate fall. But we have a fixed exchange rate. So the policy of the government is not to let the price of the currency change. So how can the central bank push the price of the dollar back up to where it was before? Simple. It'll go into the foreign exchange markets and start selling foreign currency and buying dollars. That'll push the value of the dollar back up. But it also means that dollars are being extracted from the markets. The central bank is reducing the money supply. That shifts the LM curve back to where it began, and the equilibrium back to where it began. So if you have a flexible exchange rate, monetary policy works. But if you have a fixed exchange rate, as we've seen here, monetary policy will not work. Now, let's look at fiscal policy in a fixed exchange rate regime. Assume you want to increase the size of your economy by increasing government spending. So you start here at E0, and government spending increases, and the IS curve moves from IS to IS prime. And the equilibrium would move from E0 to E1. But this causes your domestic interest rate to be above the world rate. It's here instead of here. Since the domestic interest rate is above the world rate, everybody's going to want to buy dollars so they can invest in our little country of Hawaii and earn that higher interest rate that is paid for dollar-denominated assets. If everybody wants to buy the dollar, that's going to force the exchange rate up. The price of the dollar will increase. But remember, we're in a fixed exchange rate regime, so the government wants to push the value of the dollar back down. It does that by going into the international currency markets and selling dollars. But now the central bank is dumping dollars into the markets. It's increasing the money supply and shifting the LM curve from LM to LM prime. This moves us to equilibrium point E2. The price of the currency falls and the economy gets larger, even larger, because as the currency price comes down, net exports will increase. So if you have a fixed exchange rate, fiscal policy will work. The ISLM model shows the combination of output and domestic interest rate that bring this equation into balance. Now notice that the interest rate and output are the only two endogenous variables. Everything else is just a given. That's why the graph is plotted with those two variables on the axes, output on the horizontal and interest rate on the vertical axis. But now we're assuming that the domestic interest rate is fixed at the world rate. Our star is now an exogenous variable. It is not determined within the model. It's simply a given. But we're adding this term, net exports, to the model, and net exports are determined by an endogenous variable, E, the exchange rate. So exchange rate is replacing interest rate as one of the two endogenous variables, the other being output. That's why the graph of Mundell-Fleming is plotted with exchange rate on the vertical axis instead of interest rate. The Mundell-Fleming version of the IS curve shows the combinations of exchange rate and output that bring the goods market into equilibrium. You can see the IS curve still slopes down, going from left to right, but now it's caused by, if the value of the currency falls, you have a low exchange rate. That will cause exports to go up, and so output will go up. So a low exchange rate corresponds to a larger economy. So the Mundell-Fleming version of the IS curve looks pretty much the same. But the Mundell-Fleming model of the LM curve, shown on the right, is very different from the one in the ISLM model. Now it's vertical. Why is it vertical? Excuse me. The demand for real money balances, here on the right, is a function of the interest rate and output. Output, how much stuff there is to buy. If there's more stuff to buy, you want more liquidity to be able to buy. The interest rate, that's the opportunity cost of holding cash. If the interest rate is high, you don't want to hold a lot of cash because cash does not pay interest. So there's no E, there's no exchange rate in there. So changing the exchange rate does not shift the LM curve. In this equation, the left side is the supply of real money balances. The money supply divided by the price level. We're assuming the price level is constant. So this is the supply of cash. This is the demand for cash. Prices and interest rate are exogenous. The central bank just sets M, the money supply. So the only thing that can change to make this equation true is Y, output. There is one and only one level of output that brings the money markets into equilibrium. So output has to adjust to equate the demand for money with the supply of money in real terms. Now, what happens to the LM curve if the money supply is increased? The answer is the LM curve stays vertical but shifts right. Why does it shift right? The equation for the LM curve, money supply divided by price level, is a function of the demand for liquidity, which is determined by the world rate and output. If the central bank increases the money supply, then the left-hand term becomes larger. To keep the market in equilibrium, the demand for money must also grow. R can't change, therefore Y has to. Y has to increase to compensate for the larger M. Well, that just means that instead of being here, you're here. Output increases to keep the supply and demand for liquidity in balance. Now, combining the new IS and LM curves, pardon me, shows the combination of exchange rate and output that brings both the goods market, the IS curve, and the money market, the LM curve, into equilibrium. Let's look at a change in fiscal policy with using this model under the floating exchange rate system. If government increases spending, the IS curve will shift right. But since the LM curve is vertical, the entire effect is seen in the exchange rate going up. Output does not change. In the ISLM model of a closed economy, a shift right of the IS curve would cause the economy to grow and the interest rate to go up. But in a small open economy with perfect capital mobility, as soon as the domestic interest rate rises, even the tiniest bit above the world rate, tons of foreign financial capital will flow in to take advantage of the rate difference. But in order for foreigners to buy US bonds, They have to first buy US dollars because the bonds are denominated in our local currency. So the capital inflows would cause an increase in demand for dollars in the foreign exchange markets, which would cause the price of the dollar to go up, the exchange rate would go up. A higher priced dollar makes our exports more expensive for foreigners to buy, and imports cheaper for us to buy. That causes net exports to fall. And the fall in net exports offsets exactly the amount of the fiscal expansion. Basic lessons about fiscal policy. Government spending is always going to crowd out something. In a small closed economy, it crowds out investment by causing the interest rate to rise. In a small open economy, government spending crowds out exports by causing the exchange rate of the currency to rise. Now, what about monetary policy? What happens if the central bank tries to increase the money supply? An increase in the money supply from LM1 to LM2 throws the money markets out of equilibrium. To restore equilibrium, either output has to increase or the interest rate has to fall, or some combination of the two. But because it's an open economy, the interest rate can't fall. So output has to go up to restore equilibrium in the money markets. Now, initially, the increase in the money supply puts a downward pressure on the interest rate domestically. In a closed economy, the interest rate would fall. But because it's open, when the interest rate tries to fall below R star, savers send their loanable funds out of the country into the world financial markets. For example, they sell dollars so that they can buy euros, to buy euro-denominated bonds. The capital outflow causes the exchange rate to fall, which causes net exports to increase, which is the mechanism through which the economy grows. In a closed economy, an increase in the money supply drives the interest rate down, which increases investment, which increases output. But in a small open economy, an increase in the money supply drives the exchange rate down, which increases exports. And you end up with, again, the economy growing. Now, this leads to an interesting question. If we increase aggregate demand at home, won't that increase world aggregate demand? Because world aggregate demand is just the sum of all the individual countries' aggregate demand. Well, the answer is no. Remember that since we're defining Hawaii, the US, as a very small open economy, nothing we do here will change anything about the world economy. World aggregate demand will not change. But if ours is going up and the total is not changing, that means someone else's aggregate demand has to be going down by the same amount. So in this model, increases in domestic income and employment are at the expense of losses in other countries. So it's a zero-sum game, essentially. Now we come to trade policy. What happens if a country tries to increase net exports, by restricting imports, by imposing a tariff or a quota? Well, at the initial exchange rate, the tariff or quota shifts domestic residents' demand from foreign goods to domestic goods. The reduction in demand for foreign goods then causes a corresponding reduction in the supply of the country's currency in the foreign exchange markets. You don't need to sell dollars to buy euros if you're not buying products denominated in euros. This causes the exchange rate to rise. The dollar becomes more valuable. This appreciation in the dollar reduces net exports, which offsets the import restrictions' initial expansion of net exports. So a tariff or a quota will reduce imports, but it'll also reduce exports through this mechanism of changing the exchange rate. And the net exports will end up being exactly the same. Now, how do we know that the effect of the appreciation on net exports exactly cancels out the effect of the import restriction on net exports? How do we know they're exactly the same size? Well, we learned in chapter, I don't know if I can write it here. We learned in chapter 6 that net exports equals savings minus investment. An import restriction doesn't affect savings. It doesn't affect investment. So it can't affect the equilibrium value of net exports. Because, let's see if I can write this. Oop. No, I don't think I can. Oh well. NX equals S minus I is an accounting identity. It is true by definition. So if you're not changing savings, you're not changing investment, you are not changing net exports. So with a floating exchange rate, reducing imports with a tariff or a quota ends up just reducing exports by the same amount. So the net doesn't change. Now in this model, that means that trade restrictions with a floating exchange rate do not make your economy grow, but they actually end up making your economy shrink because you're removing some of the opportunities for gains from trade. I said in this model, because in the real world, it does get a lot more complicated, a lot messier. And there actually are additional complications that go beyond this model, where restricting trade can, under some circumstances, make your country better off. It has to do with frictions and sectoral shifts. But that's outside of Mundell-Fleming. Now, let's do all of that again, but this time with a fixed exchange rate and see what happens. Fiscal policy with a fixed exchange rate. Under a floating exchange rate, fiscal policy does not work. But with a fixed exchange rate, it does. Under fixed exchange rates, our conclusions are basically just flipped from the case of flexible exchange rates. Increasing government spending shifts the IS curve right. This puts upward pressure on the exchange rate. Demand for dollars increases. But to keep the value of the dollar constant, the Fed has to also increase the supply of dollars. So the LM curve shifts right. The consequence is that fiscal policy does end up increasing output. Monetary policy under a fixed exchange rate. Under a floating rate, monetary policy works beautifully. On a fixed exchange rate, it does not work. An increase in the money supply just puts downward pressure on the exchange rate. To prevent it from falling, the central bank has to start buying domestic currency to prop up the value of the currency. Buying your own currency, that's just pulling it out of the markets. They're contracting the money supply. And so the LM curve has to shift right back to where it started from. Trade policy under a fixed exchange rate system. Now, if you have a floating exchange rate, blocking imports does not make your economy grow. It just reduces exports by the same amount. That's not true with a fixed exchange rate. If imports are blocked, domestic demand shifts from imports to domestically produced goods, and the economy grows from Y1 to Y2. Domestic consumers don't need, therefore, since they're not buying imports as much, they don't need to sell dollars to buy foreign currency, euros. Now, in a floating exchange rate system, that would drive the value of the currency up. But in a fixed exchange rate system, the money supply has to also increase to keep the exchange rate constant. So in a fixed exchange rate system, blocking imports does increase net exports and does increase the size of the economy. Now, this gets a little political, and I prefer to keep politics out of econ when I can, but it's relevant. When now President Trump was running for president in 2016, and actually other people before him, accused China of being a currency manipulator, that they were keeping the value of their currency, the yuan, artificially low. This process is essentially what they're being accused of. Now, China claims it follows a floating exchange rate policy. That's not entirely true in terms of what they actually do. China's central bank, which is called the People's Bank of China, the equivalent of our Fed, does, on a fairly regular basis, intervene in the international financial markets to keep the value of the yuan low, because that makes their exports cheaper for others to buy, which is one reason why when you go into Walmart, you see it's filled with things that say made in China. That brings us to what's called the impossible trinity, sometimes called the impossible trilemma, but more commonly economists call it the impossible trinity. An economy can have any two of these three things. You can have free flows of capital, let people take their money out of the economy, bring it back in, go to the financial markets, don't go to the international financial markets. You can have an independent monetary policy where you can choose your own money supply level. And you can have a fixed exchange rate. But you can only have two out of the three. It is impossible to have all three. Now, examples of what different countries have chosen. The United States chooses to have an independent monetary policy. The Fed can and does increase and decrease the money supply for a variety of reasons. And we have free flows of capital. You want to take your money out of the US? You can. But we do not have a fixed exchange rate. We have a floating exchange rate. The value of the dollar is determined entirely by supply and demand in the international financial markets. Example of the second option, Hong Kong, at least for now. What the future holds, who knows? Hong Kong uses, well, their currency is the Hong Kong dollar. There are free capital flows. You can take money out of Hong Kong if you want, remove your investments and put them in some other country. And they have a fixed exchange rate. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but it's the Hong Kong dollar is, we call it pegged. It's pegged to the US dollar, meaning that one US dollar will always purchase 2 or 3, I think, Hong Kong dollars. And that ratio, as a matter of Hong Kong policy, is fixed. So they have those two, but they give up having an independent monetary policy because if they're going to have a fixed exchange rate and free flows of capital, then they have to be able to control the money supply to keep the value of the currency fixed, which means they don't have discretion in their money supply anymore. Their monetary policy is commanded by the need to keep the exchange rate fixed. Third option, mainland China. They do have an independent monetary policy. The People's Bank of China decides what the money supply will be. And they have, to some degree, again, it's in this weird gray area, but at least to some degree, they have a fixed exchange rate. They actually let it float, but only within a narrow window. If it starts to get outside that window, they intervene. What they give up is free flows of capital. If you have an investment in mainland China, you may or may not be able to take your money out of the country. If you are a wealthy person in mainland China, you will have a great deal of difficulty getting your wealth out. Let's see. Now, up until this point, we've been pretending that the United States, well, let's see, where was that? Nice little graphic I made that makes me laugh. We were assuming that the United States is this little teeny economy, open but very small. Now we're relaxing that assumption. The United States is actually not just Hawaii. It's an open economy, but it's a large open economy. So domestic choices economically can potentially alter the world market's equilibrium. The model of the U.S. as a closed economy is not perfect, because we're not a closed economy. Modeling us as a small open economy doesn't really work either. But it turns out a large open economy can be modeled fairly well as a compromise between these two models. If you take ISLM, which models a closed economy, and Mundell-Fleming, which models an open economy, well, the US is going to behave somewhere in between. So, for example, if the United States increased the money supply, it will force the interest rate down some. It will force the exchange rate down some. It will increase investment some, and will increase exports some. But the total effect will end up being pretty close to an average of the two models would predict. So, in summary, Mundell-Fleming, it's a modification of ISLM, but for an open economy. It shows how policies can change and shocks can affect the exchange rate, which is something not included in ISLM. It predicts that fiscal policy will work with fixed exchange rates, but will not work with floating exchange rates for a small economy. And monetary policy, the other. It will work under a floating rate regime, but will not work under a fixed rate regime. Not so much that it doesn't work under a fixed rate regime, it's just that a fixed exchange rate regime is where you have made the choice to use monetary policy to keep the value of your currency fixed. So you are voluntarily giving up the ability to use monetary policy for other reasons. Oh, let's see. That's about it from Mundell Fleming. Hope you enjoyed it, and let me know if you have questions. Bye.